Today I'm going to show you how to get some faster renders in Unreal Engine 5, and to do that we're going to use a previous project that I did with my friends over at Stoneblade Entertainment. This is a 73 frame shot from a Steam trailer I did for their game SoulForge Digital. This is a follow-up video to my last video on my render presets that I use for a lot of my client work, and I wanted to show you how to use them a little bit more intelligently so you can make more intelligent decisions when it comes to rendering in Unreal. I should mention, Unreal is not magic. Sometimes you can throw too much at a render and it'll crash or it'll break a project, etc. So that being said, let's go ahead and hit the clapboard so we can render this shot. I have this level sequence right here, and if we click on the settings for this render, we have our saved floppy disk render stuff in our content browser already, and most of the time, I will start off one of my projects with one of my clients rendering with this preset right here, 1:8 PNG 2K. It's basically an 8-bit PNG image using the default deferred rendering with one spatial sample count and one temporal, overriding anti-aliasing, rendering our warm-up frames with a warm-up count of 48 frames. We're also including our game overrides to brute force cinematic quality settings, as in we are basically saying, hey, whatever the computer and our graphics card is capable of, brute force it to cinematic no matter what. Now, it's important to mention that I have two 3090s in my computer, and at the time of this recording, last I heard, you can only use one GPU for rendering in Unreal, but that may have changed, so don't quote me on that, and I should do more research on that. Let me know in the comment section down below if anyone knows anything about that. Let's go ahead and save this on our computer. I have a folder on my desktop, 2K PNG right here, select folder, hit accept. Now, when I hit the render button, what's going to happen is our movie render queue is going to come up. We're going to start doing our warm-up frames, and it's going pretty fast. And once it finishes warming up, it's going to start rendering our shot. The reason why I do the warm-up is I have these little Niagara particles in my project, and I want to have those already spawned and emitted and moving before I actually start making frames for my render. We can see here that the subsample is going up for one sample per temporal count, and if we had an additional spatial count, it would also multiply that number, but 1:8 is fine a lot of the time. So this render is going to be pretty fast. It's not quite real time, but it is still less than a minute, and I'll take that. Yeah, it's going to be, we're pretty much almost done. So with that done, I just want to quickly demonstrate what anti-aliasing does. I'm going to turn off anti-aliasing but keep on my game overrides, because if you turn this off, you might get some weird sphere spawning in the center of your shot. So let's go ahead and save this shot again. We'll call this one the same thing, but with no AA. And when we hit the render button, it's going to go much faster because we're not rendering our anti-aliasing. So we can see here that we're going to be done. It's pretty much real time, which is pretty sweet. Now, I'm going to show you one more thing. We're going to go ahead and turn on the anti-aliasing, but I'm going to go into my scene and I'm going to find one object or two objects. Hit T on the keyboard to select any transparent object, and one of my favorite plugins in Unreal by the Mr. William Fauché, the Unreal Knowledge God. He made this amazing plugin, and it's great for adding a little bit of atmosphere, but it will slow down your renders, and pretty much adding any translucent object that's creating depth and atmosphere will slow down your renders. So if I go ahead and delete the BP Easy Fog and just go ahead, yeah. Not a big deal. Don't need that stuff. And then we go to our render and make a new render with the 2K settings. And now we can hit the render button and render this shot out. And we can see here that the warm-up is going significantly faster, and it should kick off even faster because Unreal is not rendering layers of transparency and translucency to create that depth, because basically the ray or the pixel is coming from the camera and shooting into the scene, and then it hits the fog card, and it's like, okay, we hit the fog, and then it goes beyond the fog card and hits a static object like this rock, and it's like, oh, but we have a fog card in front of it, so we need to adjust that before we can actually render out the pixel of the rock, because there's something in front of it that's only half opacity. So that being said, fog will slow down your renders a little bit, but that's okay. Sometimes we can be a little patient sometimes. I'm going to go ahead and undo and bring that fog card back. And now we have the fog back, and I'm going to do a 4K render now. So I'm going to go into my settings and select my basic 4K render, and I will do this one a lot of the time because even though I may be rendering social media content that will be exported in 2K, I will render a 4K image so then when it super samples it down and makes it smaller, we'll get a little bit more detail with some of the content in our frame. So we have a 4K render here. I'll save this on my desktop. We have a 4K shot right here. Hit accept and render local. And when I move this over, we can see that this warm-up is now slower. The reason why is it's loading all the assets into the graphics card and into the VRAM and into the GPU, but then it's also trying to output a 3840 by 2060 image. We're basically playing the game in the background. The computer is rather playing Unreal Engine to create these frames. Now, when we're doing our anti-aliasing, we're basically making a frame for every sample, and then Unreal is doing magic on the back end to help create a blended motion blurred image. So this render is going much slower, but it's now going to be in 4K. So it's going to be about 15 minutes. I'm just going to let this finish.
2,000 years later.
I did lie. It's actually not going to be 15 minutes. It's going to be more like 5 minutes. When it does the warm-up frames, it does the estimated time calculation, including the warm-up stuff, but that did end up being a little bit slower. It's still going pretty fast for a 4K image, which I'm pretty stoked about. So that shot finished rendering, and it still was pretty fast. And now I'm going to show you the render settings that I use a lot of the time is going to be this Jags Unreal 1x8 Aces 4K. And let's go ahead and overwrite it. And when we see the render settings here, we have a 16-bit EXR with 8 samples of anti-aliasing. We're overwriting all the stuff. We have our color output with Aces, CG, console variables, which is very important. This will slow down your render a lot, but it could help get that last like 1% if you can. So this one I'll do right before I go to bed. Let's go ahead and set an output directory for this, and we actually already have these frames rendered right here because it's going to be very slow and I didn't want to wait. So let's just demo shot. Sure, just to quickly demonstrate that this is going to be slow. It's going to be slow, but that's okay. I'm not sure if you can hear me or see me, but my OBS is freaking out because basically what's happening is we're loading in a 4K image into the GPU and loading up all this game content. But also what we're doing is the console variable, the screen percentage, is set to 150%. So we're taking a 4K image and scaling it up by 150%. So what is that, like a 6K image basically? And then super sampling it back down to a final output resolution of 4K, which means that we're loading in a lot of content into our VRAM and our GPU. And I'm also trying to record on OBS. So these are the render settings that I'll use for, like, this is my art. This is the stuff that I want to be in my portfolio, and I don't care how long it takes. But when you're on a job, sometimes you just have to get stuff done quickly. And you have to evaluate what is going to be the most important thing. Is it going to be speed or that like 2%? To which, while we wait for this render to go, I thought I might as well shout out a book that I highly recommend, Rebel Without a Crew by Robert Rodriguez. He did Spy Kids. He did a lot of movies. El Mariachi is one of the ones that he's most known for. And he did everything in one take. And I share this because sometimes you can communicate what a shot needs with very simple camera moves, with one shot, with basic lighting, etc. So trying to pixel an image for a little bit of anti-aliasing doesn't really matter if the shot doesn't actually help move the story forward. So that being said, choose your render settings wisely based on what does the project need. This render is what? 10-15 seconds per frame. And fortunately, I already rendered this out, and we're going to quickly demo it in DaVinci Resolve, but it will give me 1, maybe 2%. So all that being said, why don't we go into DaVinci Resolve now and actually see how all this stuff looks, and you can evaluate for yourself what is going to be the right render setting for you. So we finished our test renders, and now we are in DaVinci Resolve. Let's go ahead and take the base settings, the 2K PNG sequence, and if we put this on our level sequence and hit the spacebar and play it back, sure, that looks fine. That looks great. And if you're watching on a 4K monitor, it's probably going to look pretty half decent. Now, if we go to a 4K image, we can see here that we're getting a little bit more sharpness. I will acknowledge that the particles are going to be different in each of these shots, but that's okay. I prefer rendering in 4K, especially with the current social media ecosystem of YouTube doing less bad compression to 4K images, which is why I render most of my stuff in 4K, even though most people will be watching it in 2K on their phones. So I will use the 4K render preset a lot of the time, and that gets me 99% of the way there all the time. Now, to quickly demonstrate, let's go ahead and take the no fog version and drop this in, and we can see here that this still looks pretty good. I personally feel that from a design standpoint, the fog helps the scene a little bit more. But all that being said, this shot tells the story just as much as this shot. So again, what is actually important to the shot, and do you have time to add it? Or does it not make sense? To which you could just be like, no fog, who cares? We don't have the time to render that, which is fine. So that being said, what if we look at the no anti-aliasing of the images, and even then, this looks pretty good. Now, the reason why I always add some anti-aliasing is sometimes you'll get some weird jaggies in motion blur. Fortunately, the motion blur in this scene is actually not that bad, and if we go ahead and jump to our color page, if we look at this shot versus this shot, I personally feel that if we zoom in right here, here's the no anti-aliasing for this shot, and if we jump to the anti-aliasing, that looks so much cleaner. So adding anti-aliasing will definitely help your renders when it comes to rendering in Unreal. Now, the last thing I want to show is the EXR 4K Aces. Let's drop this in, and first off, it's dark. What gives? Why is it dark, Jags? Well, if you go into the color page, if you recall, I mentioned we're rendering this in the Aces profile. So very conveniently, in the studio version of DaVinci Resolve, we have the Aces transform. We can go ahead and drop this at the very end of our node chain, set the input transform to, we hit the A on the keyboard for Aces CG, and the output to Rec 709. And the reason why I know that is because in the cogwheel in the lower right hand corner of my project settings, we have our color management, and I want the timeline color space to be Rec 709. So that being said, we have our 4K EXR image, and if we go ahead and fit our preview, we can see this image versus the 2K image, and there's definitely going to be some slight color shifting because this image, the PNG, is 8 bits of color versus the EXR is 16 bits of color. So we're going to get a little bit more color range in the shot. Now, I will add another thing, and that is in the PNG sequence, if I go ahead and add a curves adjustment, it is going to behave differently than me doing color grades to the EXR sequence. So if I select this node before the Aces transform, it is going to give me a much more different look for the color grade. And I prefer this look because it's a lot more subtle as far as a lot of the effects that we can add to this and really fine-tune very small increments of our image. So that being said, when it comes to rendering with 2K PNGs, go ahead and reset this, and 4K EXR 16-bit, you have to decide what is going to be best for your render and your shot. When it comes to Unreal, what you see is what you get is typically how I work, And that's how a lot of my render settings are built. And a lot of the time when it comes to rendering in Unreal, you have to consider how much stuff is in my level and is it going to really slow down my render. If you have a bunch of extra translucent cards and fog and stuff, it will slow down your render. If you're adding a bunch of samples in 4K, or if you're trying to render an asset pack from the Unreal Marketplace that's this giant video game open world level, and you try and load all of that grass and foliage into your GPU, it may slow down. So what do you do to get faster renders in Unreal? I recommend you do this. When you go to your render settings under the movie render queue, you start with some base level of anti-aliasing. I recommend 8 because I find that removes most of the jaggies and grossness, and then either increase or decrease your temporal sample count if you have a ton of movement in your scene. And then if you want the absolute extra, you know you're going to be doing some color grading in post, you would go to your color output and set this to either disable the tone curve or you use the whole ACES OCIO configuration, and there's other videos linked in the description down below explaining how to do that. If you want the absolute most color fidelity, look fidelity possible, you go to your settings and you go to your console variables and you add the screen percentage r.screen percentage, and you set this to a number beyond 100%. So you set it to like 150. Now, if you don't have the most powerful graphics card in the world, then you may have to compromise and use a basic 1:8 anti-aliasing with an 8-bit PNG. And again, if we jump back into DaVinci, this, which is the 8-bit PNG, and this, which is the 16-bit EXR in 4K, still look pretty close. So please, for the love of God, stop pixel fucking your renders and go make some fucking art. Okay, sorry, rant over. I wanted to make this video as a follow-up to my render presets because I realized, and some people did mention, why is it so slow on my computer? Graphics cards is going to be a huge impact on what you can throw at your scene, and I do recommend checking out William Faucher's video on the type of computer that you need for rendering in Unreal. But that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you learned something, let me know in the comment section down below. Questions, comments, concerns, whatever else, comment section is down there for that as well. And as always, I will leave you with the final tip, and that is to eat 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. Goodbye, my friends. Bye.